been some time since we explored the world of Switch emulation on Android, and this time around we're back to check out the latest of the various Switch emulators, Eden, which recently has seen some major updates. This will be the first time we're going to have a dedicated video to Eden, but that's not the only first. We will also be looking at Switch emulation performance with the Mediatek Dimensity 8300, which now powers two of Anbernic's high-end Android handhelds, the RG557 and the recently released RG477M. With the amount of power under the hood, it will be interesting to explore the capabilities of the Dimensity 8300 and see where we stand with Switch emulation, since not too long ago, I looked at PlayStation 3 emulation with the Dimensity 8300, and the results were better than expected. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we dive back into the world of Switch emulation, complete with a setup guide, tips, and of course our gameplay showcase. So let's dive right into the setup and install process, and the first thing we're going to do is head on over to the official GitHub page for Eden and download the latest version, which is currently version 0.0.3-RC2, and this can all be done directly on your device by opening up your browser of choice such as Chrome. Now this could very well be a different version by the time this video goes live, but all of my testing has been done with this release candidate. So scroll down until you find the Android builds, and for this you will want to download the Android standard build, which is the recommended build for most users. Now you might get a prompt to allow the download, so just go ahead and select download anyway and it should proceed. Once downloaded, open the file, and again you might get a prompt if you've not already given permission to install unknown apps. Now once you've toggled that on, you can then proceed to install the APK for Eden. So let's go ahead and open this up, and the first prompt you will get on screen is to allow Eden to find, connect to, and determine the relative position of nearby devices. Now if you have plans on using a Bluetooth device such as external controllers, you will want to allow this, which is what I will be doing here. And now we have the Get Started screen, so go ahead and tap on that so that we can proceed to the next step, which is to actually grant permission for notifications. And I usually just skip this step so I don't receive any of those notifications. It's now time to add the prod keys, and unfortunately I can't share those files here, but a quick Google search should point you in the right direction, and the file you will need will be simply prod.keys. And this should match the Switch firmware that you are using. So for example, if you are on Switch firmware 18.1.0, then you will want prod keys that match this. As you can see, I've selected my prod.keys file, and now it's loaded up and good to go. So now we need to install the Switch firmware, and again I can't share that here, but a Google search will get you to the right location. Again, make sure that you match your firmware to your prod keys file, and Eden does support up to version 19.0.1, so make sure that you don't get anything newer than that. Personally, I use 18.1.0, but the newer 19.0.1 won't be any issue. Now you don't need to extract the contents of the firmware, and you can actually just load it right into Eden as a zip file, as you can see here. Once selected, it will begin the firmware installation, and then we can proceed with the next step, which is to add your games directory. I usually just keep all my games in a folder named Switch, and then I just go from there. You might need to allow Eden to access files in the specific folder you select, so just go ahead and do that, and then the Add Game Folder screen will appear. There is an option to select Deep Scan, which will go into the subfolders within the selected folder, and so select this option if you have some games in subfolders. Otherwise, you can leave it unchecked like I've done, and then just hit OK, and now we're done and ready to continue on. Now on the home screen of Eden, you will get a first time message that this is a pre-alpha software, and I will talk more about this in the tips and expectations section, but very quickly, Eden is a work in progress, and this message lets you know that the software is in pre-alpha stage, and may have bugs and incomplete feature implementations, which is definitely accurate. So just select Don't Show Again if you don't want to see this message pop up every time you launch Eden. And with that out of the way, we have our home screen, and if you had some games loaded up, they will appear here on screen. So let's now dive into the settings section so that we can talk about our default settings for this video and just go through a few options that are available to us. Tap on the gear icon in the top right corner, which will take us into the settings screen, and this might look familiar if you've used any fork of Yuzu in the past. So let's focus in on the advanced settings section first and tap on that option. And here we have quite a few things that we can adjust. But let's first dive into the system option, and here we can change things like our device name, as well as the ability to adjust the limit speed. which depending on the game can actually be used to uncap the frame rate. And I will be letting you know throughout the showcase which games can make use of this feature, since we have enough overhead here that we can enjoy higher frame rates if possible. But as our default setting, we will leave this at 100%. But just be mindful that this is where we can make that change. We will be toggling on the docked mode setting as our default, since many games will be able to handle the higher resolution that comes with enabling this setting, and everything else will remain at default. So let's now head into the graphics section, and there are a few settings worth noting here, including the ability to adjust the accuracy level, which some games will require, but for now leave this at the default, and we will be leaving the resolution at 1x, but since we've got the dock mode toggled on, we will be playing games at 1080p. By default, Eden has the disk shader cache option enabled, and we will leave this alone. We will skip over the force maximum clocks since the Dimensity 8300 has Mali graphics, and so this is not a feature that we can use. But the option below, which is the use asynchronous shaders, can be enabled as our default. Since I found that most games in this showcase work great with it, and it really does help a lot with the stuttering that you get from shader compilation. And since we have the power on hand, this is a great feature to utilize, so make sure to enable this. Let's scroll down just a little bit, and towards the bottom we have the ability to adjust the aspect ratio, and if you're on an RG557, you should just leave this at the default 16:9, but if you're using an RG477M like I am for this video, you can force a 4:3 aspect ratio, and yes, I will be a stretching heathen and make use of every pixel I have on screen for this showcase, but change this setting to your preference. And everything else can just be left alone here. Okay, so back one screen, and Eden has a few overlays that you can enable, which they have actually separated out under Performance Overlay and Device Overlay. And this is something that you can toggle to your own preference. By default, the overlays are enabled, and if you prefer not to see this information, this is where you can toggle them off. So let's go back, and we can actually skip over the audio section since we won't be making any changes here. And now let's head into the debug section, which does have one important setting that I like to adjust when testing games, which is under the CPU backend. By default, it is set to use the native code execution, but you can change this to the slower JIT option as a troubleshooting step. And I don't believe any game requires this change for the showcase, but as always, I will let you know. For now, just leave everything here at the default setting, and then let's head back one screen. Now, a feature that is unique to Eden is Eden's Veil, which really lets you get into some experimental options that you can tweak, and it's just an extra option when it comes to troubleshooting and fine-tuning game performance. There are a few games that will make use of some of the experimental settings in here, and I will let you know specifically what needs to be adjusted, but for now let's just leave this alone and move on. Finally, the last section we have here is the applets, and right now there's not a whole lot here, but one cool setting is the AirPlay mode, which utilizes your Android device's AirPlay mode setting to pass onto Eden, and then tells any game that you load up that you're using AirPlay mode and therefore not connected to the internet, which can be useful for certain games that need an online check bypassed. For now, we can leave this alone, but if you have a game that refuses to launch because of this, try enabling your device's AirPlay mode and then toggling this option on. Alright, we're finally done with the advanced settings, and there's not a whole lot left to cover, but to the right of the advanced settings option is the controls section, which allows you to map built-in controls, and usually this is already done, but this is pretty simple to do, and the fastest way is just to select the auto map controller option, and then select your controller. For my RG477M and RG557, this will show up as a retro game joypad, and Eden will take care of everything for you. If you want to change specific assignments, just scroll down and then map as needed. Okay, let's go back, and since we have a Dimensity chip, we won't be able to utilize the GPU driver manager since we've got Mali graphics on board, and while there are custom drivers out there, honestly, I've tested a lot of these, and generally just stick to the system driver and then don't worry about this too much. Alright, so I think we've covered the important parts for the settings section, and everything else here is not really needed, at least for the scope of this video. So let's go back to the Eden home screen, and there's just a few things that we can look at here. Now, you might have noticed that my games are arranged in a carousel, but we can actually change the default view by tapping on the eye icon in the top right corner, and we have the option for grid, list, and carousel. I like using the list option since it's just easier for me to navigate the games I have on board. We can also sort our game library by alphabetical order or by recently played or added. One last and very important thing to discuss here on the main screen is the ability to set per game settings, and this is very useful for any games that might require specific changes from our default settings that we just established earlier in this video. So let's use Darksiders 2 as an example. If you tap and hold on the game icon, you will be taken to a new screen which lets you adjust settings specifically for the game. From here, we can do all sorts of cool things like install game-specific updates and DLC, but most importantly, adjust any settings for this game as needed. And again, I will let you know throughout the video if a game deviates from the default settings. Alright, we're all done with the settings, and now let's just talk about some tips and of course expectations here, since as Eden lets you know very clearly when you first launch it that it's a work in progress. And as such, all kinds of issues and bugs should be expected here, including games that crash randomly, lock up, and even Eden itself is quite unstable at times. I definitely recommend making most of your changes beforehand, because once you're in-game, you do risk the chance of crashing the game when you adjust any available settings, and it's almost a guarantee based on my experience. I've noticed that Eden will almost certainly crash when you exit a game and then try to launch something else, and so this just all ties into the fact that Switch emulation in general is a work in progress, and as always, anything that does work well should just be considered a nice addition to the library of games that we can enjoy on a device like the RG557 and RG477M. If a game doesn't launch the first time, I always say try launching it again, and even more than once, since there's a good chance the game might still work. Another thing to be very mindful of is that some games might appear to work well at first, but then refuse to launch again despite making changes. I've noticed this happen to me on a few games that almost made the list. And it's usually because a save file will break the game, or if you progress through a game enough, the game reaches a point that it's just broken with Eden. And speaking of being broken with Eden, there are a ton of forks and versions of Switch emulators available on Android, and experiences will differ from Eden. Which means that just because a game didn't work well or at all here with Eden, doesn't mean it won't work on these devices, since again, in my experience, I've found that some games work better in Yuzu, Sudachi, and Citron. I've tested well over 100 games with the Dimensity 8300, which you can see a short list on screen here, and that's just going through and troubleshooting. But just because it's on this list doesn't mean you shouldn't try it yourself if you enjoy the tinkering aspect. Finally, the Dimensity 8300 will be a hit or miss in general because of the lack of driver support like we see with the Snapdragon counterparts and the Adreno GPU. In my experience, the games that do work very well, and performance is impressive. But again, it's just the reality of Switch emulation with a Dimensity chipset. So, enough of all that, let's get into our games showcase and really show off what we can expect from the Dimensity 8300, which ended up being a lot more than I expected, and there are well over 30 games in this showcase alone. For this showcase, I did use the newly released Anbernic RG477M with 12GB of RAM, and I do think that for the most part you can get away with the 8GB variant that is available. So it seems like many of these Switch showcases start out with Advance Wars 1 and 2 Reboot Camp, which is not only an awesome remake of the original games from the Game Boy Advance days, but also happens to be one of the most stable and consistent performers across devices and the various Switch emulators, and so it remains a very reliable entry. I don't think it's much of a surprise that it's included here, and with the Dimensity 8300, we have plenty of power to run this one with docked mode for that 1080p resolution. And for this, we can actually set the speed limit to 400%, which essentially allows the game to max out its frame rate without impacting the game's speed and logic. This means that for the overhead battlefield segments, we can enjoy 120 frames per second. And with the display on the 477M, for example, which supports 120Hz, this is a nice little bonus. The battle scenes are in excess of 60 frames per second, which is a significant improvement over how it runs on actual Switch hardware. We've got a set of Switch ports up next with the Bayonetta franchise, and at least for Bayonetta 1 and 2, which have been around since before they became Nintendo exclusives, run very well with the Eden emulator and the Dimensity 8300. Now for these games, we can likewise enjoy the docked mode for 1080p, but you will want to leave it at our default 100% speed limit, since this will impact the game speed and it will run too fast. But other than that, the default settings here work great, and it's awesome to see this game running at a crisp 1080p resolution with no slowdowns, and it's definitely what you want for this game with its over-the-top action and slick combat. Unfortunately, I did test Bayonetta 3, but I was unable to get that game to load, despite adjusting various settings, and so at least with this device and the Eden emulator, stick to Bayonetta 1 and 2. Captain Toad Treasure Tracker makes a return to the channel, and this is one I always enjoy giving some love to, since poor Captain Toad deserves it. Captain Toad Treasure Tracker takes the minigames from Super Mario 3D World and turns it into a full-fledged experience that was originally designed for the Wii U, and then ported over here to the Switch and even the 3DS. It's hard not to love this game as it's full of charm and just great puzzles that make it a pretty relaxing experience that works very well here with the Dimensity 8300 and the Eden emulator, using the docked mode for 1080p resolution, and I do recommend just using our default settings, which means keeping it at the 100% speed limit, and this one is as smooth as butter on here and very stable as well. Now, it's almost impossible for me to not include Cruisin' and Blast, which has been a game that I've featured quite consistently on the channel in various ways, and that's because it's just about the most dependable, stable, and best performing Switch game regardless of the emulator or device. Cruisin' and Blast is also a personal favorite just because I really enjoy the over-the-top racing style combined with the great visuals and fun gameplay, and so it makes it an easy one for me to feature here. It wasn't much of a surprise that Cruisin' and Blast works very well with the Dimensity 8300, and we are able to use the dock mode for 1080p. Best of all, we can adjust the speed limit to 200%, which will allow us to reach almost as much as 120 frames per second with the default settings, and definitely a great way to make use of the 120Hz panel. We've got another set of games that started out back on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 with Darksiders 1 and 2, and years later the Switch received the remastered versions known as Darksiders War Mastered Edition and Darksiders 2 Definitive Edition. And yes, they really went all in on the puns, but the games themselves are awesome and come back with upgraded visuals and some rebalancing. Personally, Darksiders 2 is my favorite in the entire franchise, and probably because you get to play as Death, which is just really cool. Now, I lumped these two together since they kind of go hand in hand, and they actually both perform almost the same on the Dimensity 8300 with Eden. For both games, you will want to set the graphics accuracy to high under the graphics option, which does fix most of the graphical issues. Everything else can be left at default, which means we get to enjoy these games in docked mode at 1080p. And I recommend just leaving at the 100% speed limit since these games are fairly demanding and don't really go much above that 30 frames per second target, but other than that, they're both fairly stable. You can always change the setting from dock to handheld mode, which will definitely help keep it locked better at that 30 frames per second target, like I've done here for Darksiders 2. Unfortunately, neither Darksiders 3 or Genesis work well here, and so it's probably best to skip them. Diablo 3 The Eternal Collection combines the base game with all of the expansion packs, and surprisingly the Switch version is one of the definitive ways to enjoy Diablo 3, and thanks to years of refinements, is a solid game overall that's a lot of fun to play through, especially for those that love lots of loot. The game is a really good fit for handhelds because of the nature of its gameplay, and with Eden and the Dimensity 8300 the performance is excellent as well, and we are able to enjoy that same 1080p resolution using the dock mode setting. For Diablo 3, I have the game set to use a 200% speed limit, which allows us to run the game above 60 frames per second, and it's very impressive to see it pushing close to 120 frames per second at times, which is a nice bonus. The game does have some odd frame pacing when left at the stock 100% speed limit, so I definitely recommend adjusting it, which helps smooth it out a bit. Donkey Kong Country Returns is back for the third time in Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, and I say the third time because this game was originally released way back on the Wii and then received a port to the 3DS, and now finally we have the Switch version, which refines everything about the game, and we end up with what I consider the best version of the game. For those that love the old Donkey Kong Country games, Retro Studios did a fantastic job bringing back Donkey Kong in the classic platforming style, and it's well worth the playthrough. Best of all, this game runs incredibly well with Eden and the Dimensity 8300, and is able to handle 1080p with dock mode without any issues. For this game, just stick to the default settings established in the beginning of the video. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for Tropical Freeze, which has a ton of graphical issues with the Mali GPU, and it's definitely a bummer. Given how many Dragon Ball games there are on the Switch, it's almost impossible to not feature one, and I was pretty hopeful that at least one of them would work well, and for this showcase, I'll be showcasing Dragon Ball FighterZ, which comes to us from Arc System Works, the same studio behind the Guilty Gear and BlazBlue franchises, if you want an idea of what to expect here. As always, we get gorgeous visuals with jaw-dropping animation that blends it all together with high-speed fighting. Now, unfortunately, it's not entirely perfect here, since this game does have some issues. And despite trying various settings, I could not get the story mode to load, and instead, I just get stuck with an infinite loading screen. Now the good news is that other modes work well, including the very fun arcade mode, and so I thought it was still worth including here since the modes that do work really well with the dock mode for 1080p, and I recommend keeping this one at our default speed limit. The Switch is certainly not short of games that were ported over from the Wii U, and Hyrule Warriors returns to the Switch with a definitive edition that combines all the content from both the Wii U and 3DS versions of the game. Hyrule Warriors is an awesome blend of the world of The Legend of Zelda with the chaotic hack-and-slash gameplay from Dynasty Warriors. The hectic nature and amount of enemies on screen actually proved to be pretty demanding for the Dimensity 8300, and at least here with the Eden Emulator, we will for the first time in this showcase have to turn down the resolution scaling from our default 2.75x using the docked mode, which will allow the game to maintain that 60 frames per second target much more consistently. Other than that one change, the game works great with the default settings and still runs better here than it ever did on original hardware. After nearly 2 decades of waiting, Metroid Dread finally gave fans the long-awaited continuation of Samus's 2D saga, which was developed by Mercury Stream in collaboration with Nintendo, and masterfully blends tight platforming, exploration, and edge-of-your-seat stealth into one of the finest entries in the entirety of the Metroid franchise. Metroid Dread has been a long-time favorite of mine when it comes to emulation as well, since it has proven to be a stable and solid benchmark game for Switch emulation. With Eden and the Dimensity 8300, yet again we see that Metroid Dread runs beautifully here with this combination, and much like the rest of this showcase, we have Dread running at a resolution of 1080p using the docked mode, and you can either opt to leave the speed limit at 100%, which will stay nice and locked to 60 frames per second, or you can adjust to 200%, which will get you above 60 frames per second, but don't expect to hit 120 frames per second with these settings, and you will definitely need to turn down the upscaling to get frame rates closer to 120. Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Remastered is our next game, and I always love being able to feature as many racing games as possible in a showcase since it's one of my personal favorite genres, and one that I've recently discovered that works incredibly well with Eden and the Snapdragon 8 Elite, and it looks like the same success translates over to the Dimensity 8300 chipset. Hot Pursuit Remastered marks the return of Criterion's take on the Need for Speed franchise that originally released back in 2010. The remastered version naturally brings improved visuals, and yes, like 95% of this showcase, Hot Pursuit Remastered can enjoy the dock mode setting for a 1080p resolution, and performance is excellent here. Unfortunately, adjusting the speed limit percentage has no impact on in-game speed, and so we are locked to that 30 frames per second target regardless of the setting. I don't think it's much of a surprise that we have yet another game that started life as a Wii U game, but found its way over to the Switch in an expanded port which combines both New Super Mario Bros. U and New Super Luigi U. This is classic Mario platforming with great visuals and lots of playable characters, and is really the definitive way to enjoy this game. New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe is another fairly consistent and stable experience across various devices and the various Switch emulators out there, and likewise does very well here with Eden and the Dimensity 8300. I have the game set to use the default settings with our usual docked mode at native resolution for 1080p, and I definitely recommend keeping this one at the 100% speed limit, otherwise you will be playing this one in super speed, and given that game is already a bit of a challenge, we probably don't need to add that to the mix. Overcooked is a perfect example of how simple concepts, when executed well, can come together for some fun and chaotic gameplay. This frantic cooking game drops you and up to 3 other players into increasingly absurd kitchens where you'll chop, cook, plate, and serve dishes while navigating shifting countertops, collapsing floors, and the occasional rat theft. If you're looking for something different to play, Overcooked and its sequel are both well worth checking out. And with Eden and the Dimensity 8300, performance is solid but not quite at the full 60 frames per second. But given the gameplay, I'd say that this is still very playable. We are using the default settings, which means that this game is running at 1080p, using the Switch's docked mode. Paper Mario the Origami King takes the long-running series back to its quirky, charming roots, but with a few unexpected foes. Literally. In this adventure, the Mushroom Kingdom has been transformed by a mysterious origami menace, and it's up to our flat 2D hero to stop the dimensional madness. While it's not a full return to the traditional RPG mechanics of Thousand Year Door, Origami King offers a blend of different gameplay mechanics to keep it interesting enough. The game's writing is sharp, the world design is playful, and visually it's one of the best looking Paper Mario games to date. And with the Dimensity 8300, it's yet another title that runs very well at 1080p, but for this one you will want to keep it at that default 100% speed limit, which means we are locked to that default FPS target. The game does use the gyro for certain gameplay elements, and thankfully it's not an issue with the 477M and 557. I just can't help myself, but I always try to include as much Persona 5 Royal when possible, since it's one of my personal favorite JRPGs, and there's just so much to love here. From the incredible visuals, soundtrack, and wonderful cast of characters, Persona 5 Royal is the definitive edition of an already amazing game. Surprisingly, Persona 5 Royal has been a pretty solid performer across various devices and Switch emulators, but has always had some small issues, but nothing really game-breaking at this point. The same can be said here with Eden and the Dimensity 8300, as we will need to change the graphics accuracy under the graphics option to high to help correct some of the visual issues with the game, and even then we still have some minor ones that pop up here and there. Other than that, in terms of performance, this game runs very well with our usual docked mode and 1080p resolution. And I actually played this more than usual just to judge its stability, which does seem to be pretty solid. It's probably not much of a surprise that we have yet another port from the Wii U with Pikmin 3 Deluxe, which takes the original game and adds some new options, including additional side stories featuring Captain Olimar. Pikmin 3 is a return to the classic Pikmin formula, with some new Pikmin types making an appearance for this game, and if you're a fan of the prior two games, Pikmin 3 refines everything to make it well worth exploring. With the Eden Emulator and the Dimensity 8300, the game runs incredibly well using our default settings with the Switch's docked mode for that 1080p resolution, and it is very stable with no major issues that I can note. Unfortunately, I did test the latest in the franchise, Pikmin 4, but I was not as successful, at least with Eden, and it's possible it will work with the other various Switch emulator forks. Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are remakes of the original 2006 Nintendo DS classics, but with a modern 3D chibi art style that sparked both nostalgia and debate. Developed by ILCA rather than Game Freak, these remakes aim to preserve the structure and pacing of the originals while giving the Sinnoh region a fresh coat of paint. The remakes include a revamped Grand Underground, expanded customization options, and quality of life tweaks like autosave and faster battles. Now, there are a ton of Pokemon games available on the Switch, and this one happened to be the most stable of them all and ran quite well. I did test various others, but they had various issues, and so at least with the Eden Emulator, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are the way to go. And it goes, since we can set a 400% speed limit, which essentially uncaps the frame rate, and the game will reach well over 60 frames per second using the dock mode at 1080p. You can always adjust the resolution scaling if you want to hit that locked 120 frames per second. Red Dead Redemption is one of the most critically acclaimed open world games of all time, and for over a decade it remained trapped on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. But in a surprise move, Rockstar finally brought this Western epic to the Switch in 2023, giving handheld gamers a chance to ride again through the dying days of the American frontier. This is a game that I've been featuring recently as part of my device testing for other videos, and I've been very successful getting this one to run with the Eden Emulator, and so I knew that I'd be giving it a shot here with the Dimensity 8300, which does better than I expected given the limited driver support with the Mali GPU. For this game, I recommend keeping everything using our default settings, but I would go ahead and change the resolution scaling to 0.75x to help keep that frame rate a bit more consistent and stable, which does have a target of 30 frames per second. Regardless, it's pretty awesome to see this game running as well as it does at all with Switch emulation in general, and I think this is one that will make many very happy to see. Now, another franchise that the Switch saw a bit of was Resident Evil, and there are quite a few of them on the console, including Resident Evil Revelations, which was originally developed for the Nintendo 3DS, and it's actually where I played it for the first time. The Switch port is an enhanced port that saw a release on multiple platforms that features better visuals, lighting, and of course smoother frame rate. Resident Evil Revelations is set between Resident Evil 4 and 5 and follows along with series favorite Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. The game runs really well with Eden and the Dimensity 8300, and you really appreciate just how much nicer the visuals look here with the Switch's docked mode preset for that 1080p resolution. I really wanted to feature more Resident Evil games, but unfortunately both Resident Evil 5 and 6, for example, while they did work, had issues that I discovered through my repeated testing that actually had me remove them from this showcase. Runner 3 is the follow-up to the cult classics Bit Trip Runner and Runner 2, and is a rhythm-based platformer where you're constantly moving forward, and it's up to you to jump, slide, kick, dance, and double jump your way through some pretty wild obstacle courses in perfect timing with the soundtrack. Charles Martinet, the former voice actor of Mario, returns from Runner 2 to provide narration yet again. I'm a big fan of the Bit Trip series, and I will admit that this is more of a selfish inclusion, since I was excited to see that Runner 3 works great here with Eden and Dimensity 8300. For this game, not only can we enjoy the usual 1080p resolution thanks to the Switch's dock mode setting, but we can actually adjust the speed limit to 200%, which will allow us to reach as much as 120 frames per second at times, and is a real treat to see for this game. I was genuinely surprised when I found out that Shadows of the Damned was getting a remaster and coming to the Switch, which resurrects one of the wildest and weirdest shooters from the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 era, and once you realize this comes from the mind of Suda51, this game starts to make more sense. This was actually a collaboration between Suda51, Shinji Mikami of Resident Evil fame, and composer Akira Yamaoka of Silent Hill fame, and the result is an awesome, stylish third-person shooter that has tons of character. Here with Eden using the Dimensity 8300, we are locked to that 1080p resolution thanks to the dock mode setting, and the game runs great with the default settings, and is definitely one of the more impressive games, especially given how well it is running. Now I noticed that we have yet to feature any kind of shmup, and so I really wanted to include Cinemora EX, which is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up that blends the classic bullet hell gameplay with a surprisingly deep narrative. There is a native Android port of this game that is long forgotten and has been delisted for a long time and no longer supported, which is why I like featuring the Switch version here, since it does run very well with Eden and the Dimensity 8300. Cinemora is a personal favorite of mine with awesome graphics, and like our prior entry, Shadows of the Dam, has music provided by Akira Yamaoka of Silent Hill fame, as well as a fun time manipulation mechanic. And much like the majority of the games in this showcase, we are running at 1080p using the Switch's dock mode, and everything else can be left at default. And I've got one more Wii U port to feature here, which is the very awesome Super Mario 3D World, but this time around it returns to the Switch with a new standalone experience called Bowser's Fury, which for me is the highlight of this particular entry and the focus of my testing. In Bowser's Fury, you play as Mario, where you explore interconnected islands, collect cat shines, and then sometimes get ambushed by a kaiju-sized Bowser. It's a fun take on the classic 3D Mario formula and well worth checking out even if you've already played the main Super Mario 3D World. We've got quite a few Mario games to feature here, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but much like the rest of this showcase, we are using our default settings at 1080p, and it runs quite well. And for a brand new Mario experience on the Nintendo Switch, Super Mario Bros. Wonder is a return to the 2D Mario style gameplay, which came more than a decade later, and it's a full-blown visual and mechanical overhaul of the classic formula. Nintendo opted to move away from the aesthetics of the new series of Mario games, and instead we are treated to a world full of color, expressive animations, and gameplay that constantly surprises. This is one of the finest games you will play on the Switch, and has been a long-time solid performer with emulation, going as far back as the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro days with its Dimensity 1100. And so it's not much of a surprise that performance here is likewise very good, but this time around we can enjoy that docked mode for a 1080p resolution, and this game does have a ton of shader compilation, but despite this we've got enough power on hand that this is mostly a smooth experience here. Mario was certainly very well represented on the Switch, and Wonder wasn't the only new experience that we were treated to, with Super Mario Odyssey releasing earlier on in the Switch's life, and what a treat this game is as well. Odyssey would go on to become one of the most critically acclaimed 3D platformers of all time, and for me it's definitely up there as one of my favorite 3D style Mario games, which kind of blends the best of Galaxy, Sunshine, and Super Mario 64 into an incredibly refined package. Mario Odyssey has always been a little tricky with emulation, and for the Dimensity 8300, at least with the Eden emulator, you will want to adjust some settings by going into Eden's Veil and then enabling the Provoking Vertex, Descriptor Indexing, and Sample Shading, which will fix most of the graphical issues, and with those changes everything else can be left at default, and it's quite stable and runs very well at the 1080p resolution. We've got one last Mario game to talk about for this showcase, with the long-awaited remake of Super Mario RPG, which completely reimagines the legendary game while still preserving its quirky tone, inventive mechanics, and beloved characters. It's the perfect blend of both old and new to make it a nostalgia trip as well as a modern RPG treat that provides something for returning fans as well as newcomers to the series. Super Mario RPG is yet another game that performs very well here with Eden and the Dimensity 8300 and has absolutely no issues hitting its target frame rate while using the Switch's dock mode setting at a 1080p resolution, and for this our default settings work great. Finally, let's move away from the Mario games and check out something that is very different, with Super Hot, which is one of those rare games that turns a simple concept into a genre-defining experience. Super Hot was originally born from a Game Jam prototype, and is a first-person shooter that is built around a unique mechanic. Time only moves when you do, which means that every bullet, punch, and shattering glass moment turns into a slow-motion puzzle that feels like you're playing inside a John Wick scene, but at half speed. And when you throw in the unique visual aesthetics, as well as the excellent performance here with Eden and the Dimensity 8300 chipset, it is an awesome experience well worth checking out, regardless of the platform. For this, I'm using our default settings, and we are running very well at 1080p using the docked preset, but for this one we can turn the speed limit up to 400%, which essentially uncaps the game and allows it to reach 120 frames per second. TMNT Splinter Fate is a top-down roguelike action brawler that reimagines the Ninja Turtles for a modern dungeon crawling audience. This was originally released as an Apple Arcade exclusive, and then later made its way to the Switch, and that's a good thing since we will probably never see this one hit Android natively. The game features fast-paced combat, and each run plays out like a blend of Hades-style progression with the classic TMNT arcade action, and the results are surprisingly pretty good. Splinter Fate, like so many of the other games in this showcase, runs at a docked 1080p resolution, and unfortunately this one is unaffected by the speed limit increase, so we can leave that setting alone, but it does run well at 60 frames per second. I did have the game crash on me, but it seems to be random, and so it's just something to be mindful of. Now we're not quite done with the dungeon crawlers, and Torchlight 2 is a beloved action RPG that emerged in the shadow of Diablo 3, and for many fans it actually outshined it in certain ways. Developed by Runic Games, which was founded by several Diablo 2 veterans, Torchlight 2 offers fast-paced, loot-driven dungeon crawling with colorful visuals and distinct character classes. Unlike its predecessor, Torchlight 2 features a sprawling overworld, randomized dungeons, and a tone that leans more whimsical and bright in contrast to what is seen with the Diablo games. With Eden and the Dimensity 8300, this game really shines on here. We can actually uncap the frame rate by adjusting the speed limit setting to 400%, which allows us to get over 60 frames per second throughout most of the gameplay sections, and of course at that 1080p docked mode resolution, the game looks crisp and beautiful. Tunic is one of those rare indie gems that captures the magic of discovery in a way very few modern games do, which was amazingly developed by one person, and is an isometric action adventure that puts you in the tiny paws of a fox armed with nothing but a sword, a shield, and your curiosity. The game wears its inspirations proudly, most notably The Legend of Zelda, but what truly sets Tunic apart is its unique in-game language system and manual reconstruction mechanic. This is truly a fantastic game that makes me so thankful that I gave it a chance and played it first with the Xbox Game Pass. And yet another game that absolutely shines here with the Dimensity 8300 and Eden, since we can yet again adjust the speed limit, this time to 400%, which allows us to run at 120 frames per second, and the game manages to stay up there hitting that frame rate quite frequently. We finally reached the last game in this showcase, and I really wanted to feature something like a Wolfenstein, but Zombie Army 4 Dead War will have to do, and that's okay because it's a lot of fun, but it's one that I featured way back in the day on the Retroid Pocket 3 Pro. This game comes to us from the makers of Sniper Elite, and it's an over-the-top, undead-filled shooter that blends third-person tactical gunplay with ridiculous B-movie horror vibes. It continues the alt-history storyline where Hitler unleashed a zombie apocalypse during World War II. And, unsurprisingly, like so many games in this showcase, the game is running pretty well with Eden and the Dimensity 8300, using that 1080p docked mode setting. But surprisingly, this game is pretty demanding, and so we can keep it at that 100% speed limit since it really just won't go above the standard 30 frames per second. And that does it for this much larger than expected showcase, and I think the results are quite impressive given the usual limitations that come with a Mali GPU. But the Dimensity 8300 here is definitely showing the power it has under the hood, and it's always fun to see what we can get away with here. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know down in the comments if there are games that you've tested with the RG557 or RG477M that work well with the Dimensity 8300. But until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.